The jungle went silent. For hours, the Marines on the hill had heard strange noises drifting up from the trees below them, branches snapping, metal quietly clinking. Footsteps that stopped the moment anyone tried to listen closely. Now the sounds were gone, and that silence was far more dangerous. Private First Class Harold Grant tightened his grip on the handles of his machine gun and stared into the darkness below the hill. Somewhere out there, enemy soldiers were waiting. He just didn't know how many. The Marines had captured this hill only the day before, during a brutal push across the island. It wasn't much more than a narrow ridge covered in thick jungle and mud. But from the top, they could see a supply trail the Japanese had been using to move troops across the island. That made the hill extremely important, and it meant the Japanese would almost certainly try to take it back. Grant sat behind his Browning machine gun at the center of the Marine defensive line. Several belts of ammunition lay stacked beside him in the dirt. If the attack came, this gun would be the main thing stopping it. Around 4:30 in the morning, one of the Marines whispered something that made everyone freeze. "Movement?" At first, Grant saw nothing. Then the jungle shifted. Dark shapes moved between the trees. More shapes appeared behind them. Then suddenly, a sharp whistle cut through the air. A moment later, the entire jungle exploded with shouting. Dozens of Japanese soldiers burst from the tree line and began rushing up the hill. Grant's eyes widened. There were far more of them than he expected. Men poured out of the jungle with rifles and bayonets raised. Some were already firing as they ran. Grant forced himself to stay calm. He didn't fire. Not yet. During months of fighting in the Pacific, he had learned an important lesson. If you fire too early, the enemy spreads out. But if you wait until they're closer, they bunch together. The charging soldiers were halfway up the hill now. 30 yards. 25. Grant squeezed the trigger. The machine gun erupted with a deafening roar. The muzzle flash lit up the hillside as the weapon tore into the front line of attackers. Several soldiers collapsed instantly, but the rest kept coming. More Japanese troops surged up the slope, shouting as they fired their rifles toward the Marine trenches. Grant swung the machine gun from side to side, cutting across the charging soldiers. The weapon vibrated violently as the ammunition belt rattled through the gun. Empty shell casings poured into the dirt beside him. Some attackers tried diving into the grass for cover. Others kept running straight up the hill. Grenades suddenly exploded along the Marine line, sending dirt and smoke into the air. One Marine shouted that the enemy was getting closer. Grant didn't look away from the machine gun. He kept firing. The belt ran empty. For a terrifying second, the gun fell silent. Grant instantly grabbed another belt and slammed it into the weapon. The machine gun roared back to life. Another group of attackers collapsed near the base of the hill. But the assault wasn't over. More Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle. Grant realized something chilling. The first attackers had only been the front wave. Now the second wave was arriving. The hillside filled with movement as soldiers rushed forward through the smoke and gunfire. Grant adjusted his aim slightly lower and swept the machine gun across the slope. The roaring weapon echoed through the jungle valley. Minutes passed in a blur of noise and chaos. Rifle shots cracked through the air. More grenades exploded. But the machine gun never stopped firing. Finally, something changed. The charging soldiers slowed. Then one turned and ran back toward the trees. Another followed. Within seconds, the attack collapsed. The surviving Japanese troops disappeared back into the jungle. The hillside fell quiet again. Grant slowly released the trigger. Smoke drifted across the slope below the Marine position. The barrel of the machine gun glowed faintly in the early morning light. Around him, the Marines looked out over the hillside in stunned silence. The ground below their position was littered with abandoned rifles and fallen attackers. Later that morning, officers counted the bodies scattered across the hill. More than 100 Japanese soldiers had taken part in the attack. Only a handful had come close to reaching the Marine line, and most of them had been stopped by a single machine gun. For the Marines who defended that hill, the lesson was clear. If that gun had stopped firing for even a few seconds, the entire position might have been overrun before sunrise,